You are listening to the Accents podcast on WUKY. I'm your host, Katerina Stoykova, and this episode has been brought to you by Accents Publishing, an independent press for brilliant voices. Today, my guest is a man of many talents, a poet, a journalist, a photographer, a radio host, an accomplished cook, and so much more. My guest today is Kevin Nance. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, I appreciate being said I'm a good cook. I appreciate that.
Well, I have to tell a story to our listeners. Last time I interviewed you on my podcast, I heard you read a series of fabulous poems, and I immediately, after the episode, asked to see a manuscript. This manuscript now is the poetry book Smoke, out from Accents Publishing. Tell the listeners of Accents about the main themes in your book.
Sure. Well, the book is called Smoke for I think fairly good reasons. Smoke as an image comes up in several different ways in the course of the book. The first one being that it refers to cigarette smoke. I grew up on a tobacco farm in North Carolina, and much of my early life revolved around working on a tobacco farm, being part of the tobacco culture, and my parents smoked. Actually, my older brother started smoking very early as well. And Really, there was not very much about our lives that wasn't influenced by tobacco, and there was a lot of negative stuff relating to it, and I guess you could say positive. It was positive in the sense that it gave us an income working in the tobacco, and that's what it was always for, as a cash crop. And in those days, tobacco was it could potentially be a profit producing crop because in those days, the federal government had subsidies that propped up tobacco prices. And so, it was something that many people did. And uh, it was part of my father's history. His father and his father's father and his father's father's father all had been tobacco farmers in North Carolina. And he took a great deal of pride in that. But of course, there was the negative part is that tobacco was known even then to be carcinogenic, and heart disease and a whole bunch of other illnesses, including the heart disease that my father and two of my brothers have died of since I was young. And so there's this sort of dark legacy that I talk about in many of the poems. And then elsewhere in the book, smoke keeps coming up as in various contexts. At one point, there's a poem in which I compare um, smoke to the soul leaving the body at death. It is referred to as a kind of fog, or something that screens us from reality or the truth, in various ways. And so the word smoke is a sort of continuing multivalent modifier and image in the book. And so that's why I called it. And by the way, the photograph is of smoke kind of curling up the front cover, and it is smoke from a cigarette. And the photograph was shot by Rob Southard, who professionally goes by James R. Southard, and he is a local photographer. I might have been able to do it, but I would have had to get lucky. And I would probably had to borrow somebody else's studio, and I just decided to go with this. And I think the result is really good. And a lot of people have complimented me and him on the cover of the book.
I have no doubt that you could have been successful in taking that photo, but I'm glad that you were able to get this award-winning photographer to contribute to the cover of the book.
Me too, and I think it's nice to have that collaboration with a local artist and to give him, credit. And of course, I paid him for it too, but it really worked well.
And how did you put the book together? I happen to know that Small contains new poems as well as like 30-year-old poems, if not
Right,
that.
right. Actually, some of the poems, I think the oldest poem in the book is right about 40 years old. And in fact, one of the earliest poems was published in 1979, when I was a sophomore at Duke University, and I wrote a poem called "Gathering Tobacco," and it was published in Poet Lore magazine in about 1979 when I was still an undergraduate at Duke. There's one poem in the book, and indeed it's the very first poem in the book, called First Light, which appeared in the archive, which is the Duke University literary magazine. When I was a teenager, all the way through my early 40s, I wrote quite a few poems. I mean, I was very dedicated to the activity of poetry, and probably I would say half or so of the poems in the book are from that earlier period of my poetry writing life. And then in 2004, I moved to Chicago for a job. I was on the staff of the Chicago Sun-Times, and I didn't have a poetry uh, community around me. And so, poetry, I think, is something you do. You have to have sort of emotional reasons for doing it. And they have to be deep and they have to be strong. You have to have a certain strength and commitment to do it. And for me, that means having an audience. When I say audience, I mean literally people to sit around and drink wine and talk about poetry with. A poetry posse, you might say. And I did, and I didn't have that in Chicago. And I was there for about 15 years. And during that time, I just sort of stopped writing poetry. And I feel bad about it in retrospect because I feel like if I had continued writing poetry during that time, well, for one thing, I just would have had a better life. I would have been happier, and I would have been living my life the way I feel like I should be, which is to say, the examined life. But I let it go. And then when I came back 15 years later and moved back to Lexington, when that happened in 2019, I reconnected with my old poetry friends in Lexington. I got connected to a friend of mine named Linda Bryant, who I had known in Nashville. I didn't actually know her as a poet back then. In fact, I don't think I knew that she wrote poetry. She and her husband Coleman have a house in Berea that overlooks this beautiful mountain, and it's on a mountain, and it looks across at the Owsley Fork Reservoir, which is the water source for the city of Berea. And I remember her saying that it was probably April of 2019. She said, "Wow, the red buds are so beautiful this time of year. And Kentucky has such beautiful red buds. And I have red buds right out in front of my house here where I live." And I thought about that and red buds, and then the red buds bloom, and then the right behind them come the dogwoods. And that combination of the red buds and the white dogwoods, and some of the dogwoods are pink too here, happens very suddenly. They kind of bloom. And I sat down and I wrote my first haiku about the redbuds. And that really sort of that got my poetic juices flowing. And then I started participating in a group of poets that Laverne Zabilski is involved with, and she and that group, which came to be known as the Blueberry Group, recharged my sense of immersion in poetry, and I sort of never looked back. And now it's become as really poetry is bigger in my life now today than it ever was in the past, even though I did a lot back in the day.
So many people are richer for you writing again, not only as readers and not only as fellow writers, but also as listeners, because I think that part of your service to the literary community is a radio show that I'm going to talk about a little later. Now, with your permission, I want to continue with Smoke. And my question, the reason that I asked the question about some of the poems being new and some of the poems being old is because it is very difficult to integrate very old poems with very new poems in the same book, and you were able to integrate everything so seamlessly. And normally people have different voices in different
Yeah,
ages.
yeah. Another thing I borrowed from Linda, and Linda is Linda Bryant, who now writes as Linda Bryant Davis. One thing I borrowed from her is the ampersand. I had never used the ampersand before, but that just happened to be something that she loved to use. And I knew other poets who use the ampersand. Nikki Finney is a good example. And in fact, I interviewed and did a profile of Nikki Finney for Poets and Writers magazine about 10 years ago. Well, almost 15 years ago now, I think. I had sort of associated the ampersand with the beat poets and with, I don't know, certain other John O'Hara, people like that. I just liked it. I really liked it. There's something about the ampersand that produces an interesting effect on the page. You don't hear it, of course, when you read the poems out loud, and so it doesn't affect how you would read a poem. And it's something that I decided I liked. And so what I did, one thing that I to turn the book into a continuous whole was to adopt the ampersand for all of the poems, including ones that I'd written decades ago. And what that did was it introduced a stylistic effect throughout the book that acts as a kind of binding agent. And so in that sense, that's a retroactive touch, but I think it sort of helped. That's one thing. The other thing was that I knew that I didn't have an entire book where there was a thematic through line. And I think, frankly, a book that is all about one theme would be maybe a little bit too much. Anyway, so what I did was I organized the book into four, I guess you would call them chapters. And each of those chapters has a distinct theme. And the first chapter talks about North Carolina and my life on the tobacco farm and my coming of age. It's the most autobiographical part of the book. The second chapter is about my pathetic attempts at having a love life, which was not. It was a bumpy road. Let's put it that way. And then the third chapter I think of as sort of being about my life as a Southerner. And both here in Lexington and other places in the South where I've lived, I have a poem called Figures of Speech, which is about, I think you could say in a funny way, sort of my education as a Southerner. And then finally, I realized that I had a number of poems that I grouped into the last section, which look toward, I mean, to put it bluntly, mortality and to some extent the afterlife, if there might be one. And so, I'm now 65 years old, and I know that's not super old by today's standards, but one does find oneself, you know, opening your mind up to contemplating what that would be like, what that's aging, let's call it aging, is a theme of that fourth section of the book. And so once I came up with that framework, I could group the poems into those four sections with a certain kind of consistency. And I think the poems, either naturally or by happenstance, also kind of broke down into chronology because the early poems are early poems. The North Carolina poems are my earliest poems. And then, love life and whatever, it more or less fell into a chronological order. And that's not strict at all, but because some of the poems that I've written about my early life are quite recent poems, but I didn't write them chronologically, but in terms of their subject matter, they became chronological.
One of the reasons that I think this book became so successful, such a literary event, was that you had 40 years worth of poems on and off, 40 years worth of material to choose the best from and to make the most of it into the best possible book. And it shows, I think that the reception has been tremendous. How are you gonna make a second book now? What are you
Well,
going to do next?
that's a good question. I have begun to think about another manuscript, and I think that certainly there will be some autobiographical poems in that second book. But I also think that I'm branching out as a writer in ways that are new. For example, there's a certain number of what we would call nature or ecological poems. I find myself, like a lot of people today, worried about the fate of the planet and the fate of life on this planet, and there's a certain grief that is, I think many people are experiencing. I think most people assume when they would grow up that life is just going to go on, as is for eternity, pretty much, as far as we know. Of course, the planet is going to burn to a crisp in about 5 billion years. We know that because of science is telling us. But for the what we would call the foreseeable future, I always thought about life is pretty much going to be the same for future generations. I think that I'm probably one of the earliest, maybe the earliest generation of people who has had to deal with the prospect of that not being true. And we're dealing now with climate change and many things are happening on the planet today that seem like existential threats um, to life as we know it on this planet. And we're kind of screwing up the planet, and that has led to a new kind of poem for me that I've been working on. And so that will be a new element in the book. I think the writing of haiku has also sort of pushed me down that path as well. I mean, I think traditionally the subject of the haiku is nature, number one. And so I think I'm more of a nature poet today than I ever was as a young person. I'm also that existential dread also applies in the realm of politics, culture. I think we live in trying times, bleak times politically. The future of democracy and in America and the state of our international politics, all of these things seems different for me. I mean, when I was growing up, we did talk a lot about nuclear war and the potential for nuclear war. That was very big, certainly in the late 70s, early 80s. But I think that we went through a period of time there where it seemed like, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, we didn't talk so much about you know, nuclear holocaust taking over the world, and that may be coming back too now. But I think the political state of affairs in the world seems much more dicey and unstable now than it ever has in my lifetime. I hope, anyway, that I've become less of a navel gazer and less interested, less hung up on myself, and more looking outward at the world and trying to deal with things that are happening in the world in my poems. And those are things that I'm still exploring and trying to work my way through. But I would say the new book, if and when it comes together, will be somewhat more political than I've written so far.
Kevin, would you mind reading a few new poems? I would love to hear them.
Sure, sure. The first one I'm going to read is a poem that was published recently in Salvation South, which is a publication out of Atlanta. And it is more in keeping with the style of the poems that I have in the first section of Smoke. And it looks back both at my own history and kind of at the past. The title is Pairs. Bartlett, Anjou, Bradford, Bosque, all just fine as far as they go, but nothing next to the pears of my youth from Aunt Lila's gnarly old tree. Their shapes bulbous and homely, their thick skin dark and mottled like a parchment treasure map, their flesh earthy and ancient with a tang of rust. I'd pull one from a cloud of wasps, gnaw it to the core, and pop even that in my mouth. Grind it with my teeth till nothing was left but seeds I'd spit on the ground. My first taste of a desire beyond hunger. Then I'd brave the yellow jackets again and steal more pears. My sweet tooth as ravenous as theirs.
It's lovely, Kevin. Thank you very much for sharing.
Well,
How is life post smoke?
how is life post smoke? Speaking to audiences and really seeing what they're responding to, how they're responding to it, and that is a communal experience that I haven't had that much of in my life. Poets, and you know this yourself. Poet writing poems is a pretty solitary experience, and it's something you do on your own. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, it's nice if you have a poetry community, a poetry family around you that you can share things with. And that's gratifying for me to be talking to a room full of strangers and realize that what I'm saying is reaching them and in a deep kind of way. And so that has been extremely satisfying and a great experience. Um, I've also done a number of interviews with people on podcast and like this one, and on the radio, and I've gotten. I did an interview with Tom Martin on his show Eastern Standard on WEKU, and I actually got people who contacted me. I had people contacting me who had heard that interview and were interested in the book and ended up buying it and sharing their thoughts about it. I suppose if you're like a best-selling author like Stephen King or somebody like that, you probably get tired of people wanting to tell you what they thought about your book. But that's a rare thing for me in my experience, and it's the response has been very positive, and people have been very, very kind and just interested, and that is a kind of validation that I never had before as a poet, and I very much appreciate that, and I thank you for being my publisher and being part of what, well, you were crucial in making that possible for me because, you know, poetry is something, I mean, it was many of the poems were published elsewhere, but in magazines that have very small readerships and years apart. And there's nothing like, there's no replacement for a poetry collection that you can read and have the poems right there in front of you. And I have a number of people who said they read the book from front to back, straight through, read the book very much in sequence. A lot of people have said that. And they read it as if it were like a memoir. And it is in a certain way. It is kind of the story of my life to a certain degree. And then I have another friend who told me that she's been reading my book for quite some time now. I think it's taken her about almost 3 months, but she's been reading one poem a day, and she just reads one poem a day, and lets each one kind of sink in, and she ponders and whatnot before she moves on to the next one. And that's also a very interesting experience to hear people tell you things like that. So it's been hugely satisfying for me. I think, my life moving on from smoke is pretty much like it was before, except that I have this. I think I probably move through the world with a greater sense of having accomplished something. Um, you know, I guess you could say I've been a successful person on some level, in one way or another throughout my life, but I never took as much satisfaction from anything I've ever done as I do from having published this book, and I thank you for that.
You're welcome. And what I have noticed with my experiences after my first book came out was that from a poet, I turned into an author. I didn't stop being a poet, but I became an author. And now I have in my, and at that point I added in my bio the author of, right? The author of, and then fill in the blank. And the other thing that was very satisfying for me post publication of my first book is that I have something that, in theory at least, would survive me, right?
Mm.
And to me that is valuable.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think that's right. What do you leave behind? What is your legacy? And I have no great illusions about the size of this phenomenon. In my case, it's not very large, but there are people on the planet who will have this book and remember it and then be able to seek it out. Hopefully after I'm gone. So yes, that's a wonderful thing, and I would say it's probably especially for poets an important thing because if you, I was sort of alluding to this earlier, if you're a best-selling novelist, you get all kinds of validation from that kind of publication history. including money, which poets don't make much of. And so I think it's when a poet has the experience of publishing a book, having it be, well received, and at least by the people who see it, that is, it's a huge thing. And so I've said this before, it is my proudest achievement in life to have published this book.
Let's finish this interview by you reading a couple of poems from Smoke.
I think a poem which sort of lays out overall themes of the book and is the very first poem in the book, and it's called First Light. Dew collects on the tobacco leaves, dripping on the sand lugs at the bottom of the stalks, waking up the rattlesnakes. Pecan trees sleepwalk in the orchard, their branches splayed like the arms of God, banishing the void with a wave. In the house, a boy is dreaming of his mother and father standing in a field of tobacco, growing smaller and smaller as he leaves them behind. He shifts in the sheets, wanting to weep, but not knowing why. The porch swing swings at the slightest breeze. And it's sort of the story of my family from the standpoint of food and drink, and it's called Mouths to Feed. My mama's people farm sugarcane in South Carolina and cut up stalks of it for us to suck the sweetness from. Shucked their own oysters and ground their own grits in the corn crib. They wrung chickens' necks with their bare hands for Sunday suppers, slaughtered their own hogs and upside down from the branches of the pecan tree, made their own sausages with black pepper and sage, and cured their own hams in the smokehouse. My daddy's people farmed tobacco in North Carolina, and on putting in days fed us in the farmhands with gallons of stewed chicken bogged down in soupy rice in a big black pot over an open fire, or with catfish fried in a cast iron skillet, the cornmeal crust crackling on your teeth. My daddy lost money every year on the farm, had to sell it off piece by piece until he became a sharecropper on his own land. Sometimes his sisters, who'd married well, brought cans of creamed corn, bags of pinto beans, a ham bone, and left them on the porch. Other times, he'd haul home blocks of government cheese the size and shape of a loaf of light bread and tell us not to say where it came from. He'd drink black coffee at the kitchen table late at night when everyone else had gone to bed, cooling each sip in a saucer before he sipped it, staring straight ahead. Um, there's a poem here that I think this is a poem that I wrote much, much later, but it fits in the timeline of my life on the farm. And I guess I'll close with this one, and it's called Eclipse. You view a solar eclipse, which they say you shouldn't look directly at because it will damage your eyes and maybe your brain for the rest of your life, but you can't resist and stand in the yard at the appointed time. And sure enough, the moon passes in front of the sun, which goes black with a rim of white like a dilated eye. And you look at everything all around you, and it seems like that night has fallen in an instant. And it occurs to you that this is the real world. And this and all that All those bright, shining days you thought you had passed through were in fact a twilight at best, and more often akin to midnight, that the sun itself is an illusion, the world itself an illusion to shield you from the truth that this is not your home. But in the next moment, everything looks normal. The farmhouse with its small rooms and peeling paint, the mimosa tree in the dusty yard, the tobacco field across the dirt road shimmering in midday heat, your parents blinking and squinting and asking what's wrong with you, and your brother rolling his eyes and laughing. That very night, you stand on the porch with its crumbling floorboards and creaking swing and study the pockmarked moon where two men will soon be walking, with its rocks and craters and dust and gravity so minimal it barely keeps you from floating away. And you picture what will happen next as you leap off the porch into the black and twinkling sky and keep on going up to the moon with its pale gleaming face and its sea of tranquility, and its other side in perpetual shadow with all those hiding places, and beyond it the stars.
Wow. Thank you so much for reading this, Kevin. I fell in love with that book immediately. And one of the things that I love so much about it is the sense of longing for some place else, not knowing what it is, and at the same time, the heartbreak of losing the place you do not want to be at. And you do this spectacularly well throughout this book. So I'm proud to have published it, and I look forward to reading more of your work in the future. And good luck with everything.
Thank you.